Hello and welcome. My name's Chris Cann with Mining Journal, and with me I have Jonathan Dunn, Anglo Americans Head of International Policy and UK Government Relations. Hi Jonathan.
Hi Chris, nice to be with you.
This one I was hoping we could talk about Anglo Americans Climate Action Plan, if I call it that. I know that's not the official term. One of the things that's been quite strongly publicised is the work around hydrogen in South Africa. And I was hoping to get an update on how that's going and if it feels like it's possibly heading towards a commercially scalable option at some point.
No, sure, Chris, and thanks for that. And let me take this back to COP actually, if I may, briefly, because at COP I was fortunate enough to be able to announce our hydrogen pledge, which is linked to the work, and I'll talk about specifically the work in South Africa at the moment. But that pledge that we made is that by 2030 we'll be producing and using 100,000 tonnes per year of green hydrogen. And the main focus of that work is that we're going to convert all of our ultra-class full trucks to use of hydrogen. That's across 7 open cut sites. And in those 7 open cut sites, depending on exactly the number of trucks we have there, we'll have between 3 and 8 hydrogen refueling points. The nature of those projects will vary, and I'll talk about the specific one that we that's the demonstration one at Mogalakwena, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in many cases that will involve us building electrolyser infrastructure, either powering it from renewables off the grid or from building our own renewables, dependent on the nature of the grid. But what was great to be able to do was to put that pledge out there, and of course people will hold us to that now, so we better deliver it. But to the point about South Africa specifically, so we've talked about this now for probably about a year or 18 months, and we are developing a full demonstration 290-ton truck, which should move for the first time under its own power beginning of next year. Exactly when, still being determined. COVID has been a bit of a difficulty with that. That's a 2,000 kilowatt truck, so it's a very significant unit. Will be able to operate in mine conditions. That's the point. And as a demonstrator, that will then lead to us bit by bit converting our entire fleet of about 400 trucks around the world. The project in South Africa is at Mogalakwena, as I mentioned, which is one of our platinum mines, or PGMs mines, I should say. And that is a fully integrated system. So the electrolyser I think is actually constructed now. It's finished. There's going to be a photovoltaic plant, 75 to 100 megawatt of photovoltaics, which will power the electrolyser. So we will be generating green hydrogen to fuel the truck, and then the truck will be replacing over time. Each one will replace one of our diesel-powered ultra-class.
Okay. We hear a lot about other hydrogen programs in the steel industry, in other industries completely. Are you able to tap into any of that technology and any of those advances in terms of some collaborative effort to move your project forward?
So the project for the truck, so there's a number of different elements to that, if I might, Chris, but the project for the truck has been a collaboration all the way through. You know, we've got a range of different technology partners bringing in their expertise, be that in batteries, because this is a hybrid, this is not powered entirely by the fuel cell, there are batteries in there as well. There's the fuel cell manufacturer, there's the power systems, which are challenging. And then there's the integration of all those systems together. So this has not been Anglo American doing it entirely on its own. It's very much been a collaboration, and that I'm sure will be the case as we go forward. There's the wider question, of course, of the wider use of green hydrogen, or hydrogen in general, but green hydrogen over time in particular. And we're seeing in discussions with lots of different people in lots of different parts of the world as to how we might be part of those conversations, be they about our own decarbonisation journey, be it about how we can stimulate growth, for example, in countries of our operation, be how we might partner with governments. I mean, Chile is very, very active in this space, as well as South Africa. And I'll just mention something in South Africa in a moment, if I may, but equally Australia, and there's been sort of high-profile announcements in Australia as well. So there's lots of different conversations. We've got to work out where we sit in this, and one part of it is decarbonising our own operations, which is where the truck comes in. Second part is then actually how can we stimulate hydrogen opportunities around our operations, and specific to that, we were really pleased to be involved in a feasibility study with the South African government and a range of other partners on the concept of a so-called hydrogen valley, and this runs from the Bushveld complex of where the platinum mines tend to be, all the way down through South Africa to KwaZulu-Natal. And that looked at a range of different vectors, but how feasible certain industries might be drawing on hydrogen in various different ways. That published on International Hydrogen Day in October, happily, and came up with 9 very kind of concrete proposals, real opportunities, which as it happens, genuinely by coincidence, we're already engaged in 2 of those different areas. So that's a fantastic example of where we're saying, okay, there's a technology here that works, let's actually do some proper analysis collaboratively with others to look at opportunities that we may or may not invest in, but others can choose to invest in as well. And we'll look to replicate that elsewhere.
Okay, and it feels like quite a bit of the climate strategy is centred on Africa, or at least Southern Africa. You've recently publicised the renewable energy ecosystem as a concept. I don't think that's just South Africa, is it? That's kind of Southern African operations. What does that mean, and how does that change the way we mine?
Yeah, just to back up a moment. So our overall strategy, of course, reflects all of our operations. The point is, as a company, as you know, South Africa is an incredibly important part of our history and our future, and remains a very significant bulk of our production. So inevitably, a lot of the specifics focus on South Africa. But if I may, that what we did with our climate change report, which we published just before COP, is we demonstrated where our Scope 1 and 2 emissions came from, fundamentally. There's a block graph in there which shows where it sits right now, and then our plans as to how we think we're going to be able to reduce them. And one very big element of our Scope 2 was essentially the South Africa grid, particularly the South Africa grid. We can talk about Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, but South Africa accounts for roughly 75% of our Scope 2. And of course, in other parts of the world, so most notably in South America, we're able to either partner with others to increase the capacity of the grid in renewables, or we can just buy the renewables off the grid because there's capacity there and we're not reducing it for others. And that's the case for all of our operations from 2023. Brazil, Chile and Peru, all of our operations will be running on renewable power, which will take us up to about 50% renewable electricity across operations. South Africa wasn't going to work like that because, I mean, for the reasons of we probably all know around Eskom, the dependence on coal, these kind of things, there was simply not going to be the capacity in the grid in order for us to first of all displace our electricity generated emissions, our Scope 2, but also going back to the hydrogen. If you're going to produce green hydrogen, you need there to be clean power. There's not a lot of point in producing your hydrogen for your truck from coal-fired power. What we looked at is we said, well, look at the incredible renewables potential of South Africa. And when you look across the whole of South Africa, you get this picture, and Southern Africa, as you say, actually this is not just the wind and the sun don't care about the borders, right? So if you look at where the wind blows and where the sun shines, and the amount of both photovoltaic and then wind generation you can get, we worked out that we might almost be able to do a 24/7 renewables only solution for our operations if we could do it across the whole country and wheel it through the Eskom grid. So over time we've developed this concept, we've built additional resilience into it, whereby we'll pair a mixture of sort of on-site, behind the meter, if you like, photovoltaics, such as the Mogalakwena one I mentioned, with some other photovoltaics, which might be the other side of the meter, if you will, with off-site wind, and then this was the additional element to produce additional resilience, was a pumped hydro storage solution using an existing mine site, so essentially using the gradients of a mine. Okay. The logic of the pumped hydro storage was, well, the logic of all of it is none of the technology is new and complex. The sort of the concept of building this together with the South African government is perhaps more controversial, although since all of the various announcements we've seen at COP, probably less so. But pumped hydro storage, for example, is an order of magnitude more efficient than a battery electric solution or even a hydrogen storage solution, because essentially all you're doing is using free electricity to pump water up a hill and then running it down through a generator. Okay. It's incredibly simple. So that combination, coupled with the integration with the grid, means that what we're looking to do is not only provide ourselves with renewable power, but help Eskom as Eskom transitions and provide greater stability, because ultimately everybody needs sustainable, affordable, reliable power for any kind of economic development, and that's what we're looking to deliver.
Okay, and just to be clear, that part of the solution, that's energy storage, that's overcoming the traditional problem with renewable power in terms of you can't decide when the sun shines and when the wind blows.
It is, although because we're on the grid, you could argue that resilience, we'll be wheeling it through the grid, so that resilience would come from it. Our thought was actually it wasn't fair for us to assume the grid would take all that load. We can provide our own resilience, but that then also becomes something that the grid could draw on as necessary. If you've got 1.5 gigawatts of resilience in the system through having a pumped hydro storage solution, there's a discussion to be had there with Eskom about how exactly that could work its way through.
Okay, and finally, last time we spoke around climate, Anglo American had considered, obviously, the detail around its Scope 3 emissions, but had decided not to publish an actual target. That has changed as of very recently, and there is a goal of 50% reduction in Scope 3 emissions by 2040. What drove the change in approach on publishing a target, and then what drove the actual setting of that target itself and that number?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work on Scope 3 over the last couple of years, as we talked about last time, and we published our first detailed inventory in 2019. And as we've understood more, that the whole question of measuring Scope 3 is really complicated, as you probably know, and we've spent much of the last 2 years digging into our own approach, understanding it, improving it. So first of all, we've got a methodology now where we really understand some of the levers we can pull. And the sort of changes we made, for example, Chris, which I think is relevant, is previously for our customer emission, for our downstream emissions, we were using industry averages, emission factors for where we were selling our product. Actually, by introducing customer-specific emission factors, i.e. we know we're feeding into our Scope 3 the emissions that come from our customers rather than an industry average, that changes in a quite material way the numbers. And of course, you can then start to look at that and think, well, okay, there's an interesting question about what levers we can pull. So that's led us on to understanding that we think there are sort of 4 areas where we can really influence, or 4 levers we can pull, if you like. One is product quality. Mm-hmm. So the quality of the products we sell, because the vast majority of our emissions sit downstream of us. The second is logistics. What can we do to drive logistics? Then there's technologies we can develop and partner with others to develop. And then finally, wider partnerships. And so looking at all of that, looking at a combination of all of that and our life of asset profiles, we looked at what we thought was achievable without expecting too much more from others. There's a risk also that you're going to be, that target depends entirely on others delivering stuff. And what we've said in our climate change report is we believe we can reduce our Scope 3 emissions by 50% by 2040 if the steel industry gets on a pathway aligned with a 1.5 degree scenario. We believe that could be as much as 80% reduction by 2040. So that's the kind of the variance there.
You're saying you don't want to rely on other industries and downstream and upstream suppliers and customers, but that feels like it's inevitable to attack the entire climate challenge. How much collaboration is there at the moment, and what are the plans for further collaboration in that part of the strategy?
There's collaborations in all sorts of different ways. So in steel, we've announced a number of different partnerships we have with some of our customers, and we're discussing more of those, and you've seen them also from others in the mining sector, and that's right. A lot of those are discussions about the product, the specific product that we can provide. So one of the issues we have in particular is our iron ore product from both Kumba and Minas Rio is of a grade that you can use for direct reduced iron forms of steel production, which is already less carbon intensive and aligns itself well with, for example, the use of hydrogen and certainly and renewable energy and what have you through an EAF process. So that's one part of the question. How can we provide the products, the real products that our customers really need as they decarbonise, because the pressure is happening along the value chain. Then there's partnerships in things like shipping, where we're working on a range of different technologies. Be that we've already run a ship partially on biofuels, which was waste cooking oil. Mm-hmm. We're looking at hydrogen and ammonia solutions for shipping. We're in partnership with all sorts of different parts of that value chain, which is obviously not a value chain we we're a big player in, but nonetheless it's a reasonably significant part of our emissions. And then we're always looking at other opportunities, particularly in the technology space. So you talked about hydrogen before. We don't know yet what role we might play there, but clearly green hydrogen will play a part in the steel industry going forward. What role we might play as a mining company in that, we're not so sure, but we're in conversations with all sorts of different parts of that debate.
Jonathan Dunn, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Chris.